The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Alexander Reeves's penthouse office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City spread out like a glittering carpet. But Alexander wasn't looking. His attention was fixed on the stack of legal papers on his desk. At 68, Alexander had built his tech company from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. He'd survived market crashes, betrayals by business partners, and a bitter divorce. But now, facing his own mortality after a recent health scare, he was considering something he'd never thought he would: giving someone else control over his affairs. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Reeves," said Howard Phillips, his attorney, of 20 years. Howard adjusted his glasses and pointed to the final signature line. "Once you sign here, Victoria will have full power of attorney." Victoria Lang, Alexander's fiancée of 8 months, smiled from her seat beside him. At 36, she was strikingly beautiful with perfect blonde hair and a smile that could charm anyone. She'd been a marketing executive when they met at a charity gala, and Alexander had been captivated by her intelligence and warmth. "It's just a precaution, darling," Victoria said, touching his arm gently. "With your condition, we need to be prepared for anything." Alexander nodded slowly. The diagnosis had been a shock, a rare heart condition that could potentially worsen without warning. Victoria had been by his side through it all, attending every doctor's appointment, researching specialists, and taking care of him with unwavering dedication. "I know," he said, reaching for the pen. "I trust you." "Excuse me." The voice was so unexpected that everyone turned. It came from the corner of the room where Imani Jackson, a young paralegal from Howard's firm, sat with her laptop. She'd been so quiet during the meeting that Alexander had almost forgotten she was there. "Did you need something, Ms. Jackson?" Howard asked, his tone making it clear that her input wasn't welcome. Imani stood up. She was in her mid-20s with dark brown skin and her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her simple navy suit contrasted with Victoria's designer dress, but there was something in her steady gaze that commanded attention. "Mr. Reeves, I don't think you should sign this right now," she said. A tense silence fell over the room. Howard's face turned red. "Ms. Jackson, this is completely inappropriate. You're here to take notes, not offer legal advice." "What's your concern?" Alexander asked, ignoring Howard's outburst. Something in the young woman's serious expression had caught his interest. Imani hesitated, clearly aware that she was crossing a professional boundary. "The power of attorney document, as it's written, gives Ms. Lang complete control over all your financial decisions with no oversight. There are also no clauses for review or revocation, except under extreme circumstances." Victoria laughed softly. "Darling, that's standard language. Howard has prepared everything properly." "Actually," Imani continued, her voice growing steadier, "I've helped prepare dozens of these documents at the firm, and this goes well beyond standard provisions. Most include safeguards and limits." Howard stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves, I apologize for this unprofessional behavior. Ms. Jackson is new and clearly doesn't understand her role. I'll have her removed from the case immediately." Alexander held up his hand. "No. Let her speak." He turned to Imani. "Go on." Imani took a deep breath. "I noticed inconsistencies when I was preparing the final documents. This version is different from what was initially drafted. Several key protections have been removed." Victoria stood up, now her calm demeanor slipping slightly. "This is ridiculous. Who are you to question our relationship? Alexander has made his decision." Alexander studied Victoria's face, noting the flush of anger that wasn't usually there. Then he looked back at Imani, who met his gaze without flinching. "What made you speak up?" he asked her. "You must have known it would cause problems for you." "Because it didn't feel right," Imani said simply. "And I'd rather lose my job than stay silent when something doesn't feel right." A memory flashed through Alexander's mind. His father, who had lost everything to a business partner he'd trusted blindly. "Always look for the person brave enough to tell you what you don't want to hear," his father had told him afterward. "They're the ones you need." "Let's take a step back," Alexander said finally. I think we should review the document again. Victoria's hand tightened on his arm. Alexander, we've been over this a dozen times. The doctor said stress isn't good. For your heart, it's just a delay, Victoria. If everything is as it should be, we can proceed next week. Howard cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, may I suggest we continue this discussion privately, without junior staff present? Actually, Alexander said, I'd like Ms. Jackson to stay. In fact, I'd like her to prepare a summary of the differences between the original draft and this version. Victoria gathered her purse, her movements stiff with anger. I have a charity committee meeting. We can discuss this tonight. She kissed Alexander's cheek, but her eyes were cold. Don't let people create problems where there aren't any, darling. After Victoria and Howard left, Alexander gestured for Imani to sit in the chair across from him. You've put yourself in a difficult position, he said. I know. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, but her gaze remained steady. You could lose your job. Probably. Alexander leaned back, studying her. Why risk it? You don't know me. Imani was quiet for a moment. My grandmother lost everything to someone she trusted. I was 13 when it happened, but I still remember how it broke her. She gave power of attorney to her nephew while she was recovering from surgery. By the time she was better, he'd sold her house and emptied her accounts. She shook her head. I'm not saying Ms. Lang would do that, I don't know her. But the changes to that document, they're designed to prevent oversight. Alexander nodded slowly. In business, he'd learned to listen to his instincts. And right now, they were telling him to pay attention. What exactly changed from the original draft? The requirement for quarterly financial reports was removed. So was the clause allowing your daughter to request an audit. And there's a new provision giving Ms. Lang authority to change your existing will. Alexander felt a chill. He hadn't authorized any of those changes. Show me. For the next hour, they went through the documents line by line. Each discovery made, the knot in Alexander's stomach tightened. How had he missed these details? The answer was simple. He hadn't wanted to see them. Victoria's attentiveness, her constant presence during his illness, he'd interpreted it all as love. What's your name again? He asked, suddenly realizing he only knew her surname. Imani Jackson. Well, Imani Jackson, you've given me a lot to think about. He closed the folder of documents. And possibly saved me from making a terrible mistake. We don't know that yet, she said carefully. These changes could have innocent explanations. Alexander smiled slightly at her diplomacy. Yes, they could, and we're going to find out. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city as dusk began to fall. How long have you worked for Howard's firm? 3 years. I work during the day and take law classes at night. Ambitious. Necessary, she corrected. Law school isn't cheap. Alexander turned back to her. I'm going to need someone I can trust to help me look into this situation more carefully. Would you be interested in a temporary assignment? I'll arrange it with your firm. Double your current salary. Imani looked surprised. Mr. Reeves, I'm just a paralegal. There are investigators who Victoria would notice immediately, Alexander finished. I need someone who can work quietly, someone who already has a reason to be reviewing my documents. He smiled slightly. Someone with good instincts who isn't afraid to speak up. Imani considered for a long moment before nodding. All right, but if we find nothing suspicious, you have to promise to consider that I might have been wrong. Deal. Alexander held out his hand and they shook on it. Later that evening, as Victoria moved around his penthouse talking about her charity meeting, Alexander watched her with new eyes. Had he been a fool, or was he being paranoid now, seeing threats where there were none? The only way to know was to dig deeper. Is everything okay? Victoria asked, noticing his silence. You seem distracted. Just thinking about the power of attorney, he said, watching her reaction carefully. Don't worry about that, she said, waving her hand dismissively. We can sign it whenever you're ready. There's no rush. But something flickered in her eyes. Annoyance? Worry? No rush. Alexander agreed mildly. thinking of the words Imani had spoken just before leaving. Don't give her power of attorney, not until we know for sure. For the first time in months, instead of just accepting what was happening around him, Alexander felt fully alert. Whatever the truth was about Victoria, he would find it. And he had found an unexpected ally in his search, a young woman who had risked everything to warn him when she saw something wrong. Sometimes help came from the most unexpected places. Alexander woke up early the next morning, his mind still churning with doubts. The city was just coming to life outside his penthouse windows as he made himself coffee, something he rarely did since Victoria had moved in with her insistence on having the housekeeper handle such tasks. He picked up his phone and hesitated before making the call. "Hello?" Howard's voice was guarded. "Howard, it's Alexander. I need to speak with you about yesterday." There was a pause. "Alexander, I want to apologize for the unprofessional behavior of my employee. I've already spoken with her about overstepping her boundaries. That's actually why I'm calling. I'd like to have Ms. Jackson assigned to review all my legal documents for the next few weeks." "What?" Howard's surprise was evident. "Alexander, she's just a paralegal. If you want a thorough review, I can assign one of our senior associates or do it myself." "I want her," Alexander said firmly. "She has a fresh perspective, and I trust her attention to detail." After more protests, Howard reluctantly agreed. When Alexander hung up, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. It was his first step toward taking back control. Victoria appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her silk robe perfectly arranged, not a hair out of place despite the early hour. "You're up early," she said, coming over to kiss him. "Everything, all right?" "Just couldn't sleep," Alexander replied. "Thinking about work." Victoria frowned. "The doctors said you need to avoid stress. That's why we agreed you'd step back from day-to-day operations." She took the coffee cup from his hand. "Let me make you some herbal tea instead, and I'll have Rosa prepare your breakfast." As Victoria busied herself with the tea, Alexander observed her. Had she always been this controlling of his daily routine? Or was he only noticing it now? "I made some calls about that paralegal," Victoria said casually, her back to him. "Apparently she's had some financial troubles. Behind on her student loans, according to a friend at the firm." Alexander kept his expression neutral. "Is that so?" People in desperate situations sometimes do desperate things, like trying to get the attention of a billionaire." Victoria turned, handing him the tea with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just something to keep in mind." The implied accusation was clear. Imani had ulterior motives, but the fact that Victoria had immediately investigated her was interesting in itself. "I'll keep that in mind," Alexander said mildly. Later that morning, Alexander met Imani at a small coffee shop several blocks from his office. He'd been careful to make sure he wasn't followed, feeling slightly ridiculous about the precaution until he remembered the stakes. Imani was already there, dressed more casually in jeans and a sweater, her hair in a loose ponytail. She looked younger outside the formal office setting, but her eyes still held that same steady, observant quality. "Thank you for meeting me," Alexander said, sitting down across from her. "How did Howard take the news of your new assignment?" "About as well as you'd expect," Imani replied with a small smile. "But he couldn't really refuse since you specifically requested me." "Victoria's already looking into your background," Alexander said, watching her reaction carefully. Imani didn't seem surprised. "What did she find?" "That you're behind on student loans." She nodded. "True. Law school is expensive and paralegal salaries aren't great. I'm not ashamed of it. She implied you might have financial motives for getting my attention." Imani met his gaze directly. "Mr. Reeves, if I wanted money from you, there are easier ways than risking my job to stop you from signing a document." Alexander found himself smiling. "Fair point. And please call me Alexander. I think we're past formalities at this point." For the next hour, they formed a plan. Imani would review all of Alexander's legal documents, focusing on anything Victoria might have had access to. Alexander would gather his own information at home, paying closer attention to Victoria's activities and conversations. We should be careful about communication, Imani advised. If she's already suspicious of me, she might monitor your calls or emails. Alexander nodded, remembering how Victoria often picked up his phone to help him manage messages. We'll meet in person, when possible. For urgent matters, I'll contact you through my assistant Thomas. He's been with me for 15 years. I trust him completely. As they were about to leave, Imani hesitated. There's something else you should know. I did some preliminary research last night. She pulled out her tablet. Victoria Lang has changed her name twice. She was born Victoria Simmons, then became Victoria Mercer after a brief marriage in her 20s, and finally Victoria Lang 5 years ago. That's not necessarily suspicious, Alexander pointed out. Many women change their names after marriage. True, but it makes her harder to track. Imani showed him a photo on her tablet. This is from a society page 7 years ago. It shows Victoria, then Victoria Mercer, with a man named Richard Cantwell at a charity event in Boston. Alexander studied the photo. It was definitely Victoria, looking slightly younger but with the same dazzling smile, her arm linked with an elderly man who looked to be in his 70s. Richard Cantwell was a real estate developer worth about $200 million, Imani continued. He died 6 months after this photo was taken. Heart failure. Alexander felt a chill. Were they married? No, but according to the obituary, he left a devoted companion, Victoria Mercer, a significant portion of his estate. Imani put the tablet away. It could be completely innocent, but given that she's now engaged to another wealthy older man with a heart condition, it's worth looking into, Alexander finished. When Alexander returned home that afternoon, he found Victoria organizing a dinner party for the following weekend. I've invited all the board members and their wives, she told him excitedly. It's important to maintain those relationships while you're stepping back from active management. Alexander noticed how she had simply assumed he would go along with her plans. Had he really become so passive? His recent health scare had knocked him off balance, making him vulnerable in a way he'd never been before. And Victoria had been there, taking charge, making decisions for him. Actually, he said, I'd prefer to keep things quiet for now. Let's postpone. Victoria's smile faltered. But I've already sent the invitations. Canceling would look strange. Then we'll make it a small gathering. Just a few close friends. Her eyes narrowed slightly before she composed her features. Of course, darling. Whatever you think is best. That evening, Alexander feigned tiredness and went to bed early. But instead of sleeping, he did something he'd never thought he'd do. He went through Victoria's things. He felt a twinge of guilt as he carefully searched her desk, but it disappeared when he found a burner phone tucked in the back of a drawer. The phone required a passcode which he didn't have, but its very existence raised questions. Why would Victoria need a second secret phone? Over the next week, Alexander observed Victoria with new awareness. He noticed how she always took calls in another room, how she had gradually isolated him from old friends, claiming concern for his health. He saw how she subtly undermined his confidence, questioning his memory of conversations, suggesting that his judgment might be affected by his medication. Meanwhile, Imani was making discoveries of her own. They met at different locations around the city, each time with Imani bringing new information. Victoria has been systematically added as a beneficiary to your accounts, she told him during one meeting. Not all at once, but gradually over the past 6 months. Small accounts first, then larger ones. That makes sense for an engaged couple, Alexander said, playing devil's advocate. Yes, but the pattern is interesting. And there's more. Imani showed him documents revealing that Victoria had been in relationships with 3 wealthy men over the past decade, each significantly older than her. 2 had died while she was with them. The third had ended the relationship abruptly, with rumors of financial impropriety. Still circumstantial, Alexander noted, though the knot in his stomach tightened. There's one more thing, Imani said hesitantly. I found these when reviewing the changes to your medical directive. She handed him several pages that showed Victoria had been granted broad authority to make medical decisions on his behalf. The troubling part was a clause that specifically prevented any second opinions or family interventions. Even his daughter would have no say in his care. Alexander thought of his estranged daughter, Lily. They had barely spoken since his divorce from her mother, a rift Victoria had shown little interest in helping to heal. I need to be absolutely sure, Alexander said, before I confront her. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following day, Alexander suffered chest pains at home and collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital with Victoria by his side, visibly distraught. Tests showed it wasn't a heart attack but a severe reaction to his medication. As Alexander lay in the hospital bed, groggy but alert, he overheard Victoria speaking with his doctor in the hallway. The stress is too much for him, she was saying. He needs complete rest, no visitors, no business calls. His daughter called. The doctor replied. She wants to see him. Absolutely not, Victoria said firmly. She'll only upset him with their old issues. I have medical power of attorney, and I'm making this decision for his health. Alexander closed his eyes, feigning sleep when Victoria returned to the room. His suspicions were hardening into certainty, but he needed more proof, and he needed to be careful. Victoria now had the perfect opportunity to control his environment completely. Later, when Victoria stepped out to speak with the doctors again, Alexander quickly used the hospital phone to call Thomas, his assistant. Thomas, I need you to get a message to Imani Jackson. Tell her where I am and that she needs to move faster. He hung up just as Victoria returned. Who were you calling, darling? She asked, her tone light but her eyes watchful. Just checking. In with the office, Alexander said. You know me. Can't stay away from work for long. Victoria took the phone and placed it out of his reach. The doctor says you need rest, no work calls. She smoothed his hair back with a gesture that once seemed loving but now felt controlling. Don't worry about anything. I'll take care of everything. Alexander had no doubt that she would, and that was exactly what worried him. As Victoria arranged his pillows, her diamond engagement ring catching the light, he wondered what else he might discover about the woman he had almost given complete control over his life. The young paralegal's warning echoed in his mind. Don't give her power of attorney. Now, lying in a hospital bed with Victoria controlling who could see him and what information reached him, Alexander realized just how close he'd come to making a devastating mistake. He needed to get out of this hospital and get to the truth, and he needed to do it before Victoria's control over his life became absolute. 3 days in the hospital gave Alexander too much time to think. Every smile from Victoria, every adjustment of his pillows, every time she shooed away a nurse saying, I'll take care of him, all of it took on new meaning. Was she genuinely caring for him or controlling him? The doctors wanted to keep him under observation, concerned about his reaction to the medication. Victoria rarely left his side, managing his visitors, few were allowed, his calls, screened, through her phone, and even his meals, special requests to the hospital kitchen. To anyone watching, she was the picture of a devoted fiancé. On the second night, when Victoria finally went home to rest, Alexander's private room door opened slightly. Imani slipped in, wearing hospital scrubs. You shouldn't be here, Alexander said, though he was relieved to see her. If Victoria comes back, she won't. I checked. She's having dinner with Howard Phillips right now. Imani pulled up a chair. How are you feeling? Trapped, Alexander admitted, and increasingly certain that something isn't right. Imani nodded, opening her bag to show him several folders. I found more connections. Victoria, when she was still Victoria Mercer, worked for a financial advisory firm that catered to wealthy clients. That's how she met Richard Cantwell. The man who died of heart failure, Alexander said. Yes, and before him, there was Gregory Palmer, oil money from Texas. She was his personal assistant. He died of an apparent stroke 2 years after hiring her, left her a significant sum in his will. Alexander felt his mouth go dry. That's 3 men. 4, actually. I found another. William Harrington. He's still alive, living in Miami. He's the one who broke things off with her suddenly. Imani hesitated. I took a chance and called him using the law firm's credentials. He wouldn't say much, just that he discovered something disturbing and ended their relationship immediately. We need to know what he found, Alexander said. I'm working on it, but in the meantime I found something else. Imani showed him bank statements from an account in Victoria's name, showing regular transfers to offshore accounts. These transfers began just after you two got engaged. Alexander studied the statements. The amounts weren't huge, not for a billionaire, but they were consistent monthly transfers that added up to over $1 million so far. She's been planning something all along, he said quietly. It looks that way. Imani glanced at her watch. I should go. The nurse will be here soon for your vitals, and Victoria might return after dinner. She packed up the documents. I've made copies of everything. I'm building a case, but we need more. Something definitive. After she left, Alexander lay, awake, his mind racing. The evidence was mounting, but still circumstantial. Victoria could explain away the offshore accounts, the previous relationships. She was a beautiful woman who moved in wealthy circles. It wasn't implausible that she'd been involved with other rich men before him. What he needed was proof of intent, something that showed she meant to harm him or steal from him. The next morning, Victoria arrived with fresh flowers and his favorite pastries from a bakery across town. The doctor says you can go home tomorrow, she said, arranging the flowers. I've already set up the guest room as a recovery suite. It'll be easier than climbing the stairs to the master bedroom. Alexander noted how she'd already decided where he would sleep in his own home. I'd prefer our bedroom, he said, watching. Her reaction, a flicker of annoyance crossed her face before she smiled. The doctor said you need to avoid stairs for a few days. The guest room is more practical. The penthouse has an elevator, he reminded her. Well, yes, but... She seemed flustered momentarily before regaining her composure. I just want what's best for your recovery. I know you do, Alexander said, reaching for her hand. You've been amazing through all this. Victoria visibly relaxed, squeezing his hand. I'd do anything for you, darling. Alexander believed her, but not in the way she meant it. Later that day, Thomas arrived with some personal items Alexander had requested. Victoria stepped out to take a call, giving them a moment alone. Did you get my message to Imani? Alexander asked quietly. Thomas nodded. She's been working around the clock. She asked me to tell you that she's meeting with William Harrington tomorrow. He agreed to fly in from Miami. Good. Alexander glanced toward the door, making sure Victoria wasn't returning yet. There's something else I need you to do. In my home office, behind the painting of the Manhattan skyline, there's a safe. The combination is Lily's birthday. Inside, you'll find a red flash drive. Bring it to me, and make sure Victoria doesn't know. Thomas nodded, understanding the seriousness of the request. Consider it done. When Alexander was released from the hospital the following day, Victoria had indeed transformed the guest room into a recovery suite, complete with a hospital-grade bed, monitors, and a full-time nurse she'd hired. Only the best care for you, she said, helping him settle in. I've rescheduled all your meetings for the next month. The doctor says complete rest is essential. Alexander noted how efficiently she was removing him from his own life. His business, his social connections, even his bedroom. The more isolated he became, the more dependent on her. I need to check some emails, he said. Where's my laptop? Oh, darling, no work, Victoria said firmly. Doctor's orders. Besides, I've had your assistant forward any urgent matters to me. I'll handle them. Alexander felt a chill. She was intercepting his communications now. Victoria, I appreciate your help, but I need to stay connected to my business. Her expression hardened slightly before softening into concern. Alexander, your health has to come first. The company will survive without you for a few weeks. Before he could argue further, the nurse arrived to take his vitals and Victoria slipped out, saying she had errands to run. As soon as she was gone, Alexander asked the nurse to help him to his actual bedroom. The woman hesitated, citing Mrs. Lang's instructions, but ultimately couldn't refuse her patient's direct request. In his bedroom, Alexander found his belongings had been rearranged. His medications were gone from the bathroom cabinet, his phone, charger was missing, and his desk had been cleared of papers. It was as if Victoria was systematically removing his ability to function independently. He was about to return to the guest room when he noticed something odd about the painting above his bed. A small landscape Victoria had given him shortly after they met, saying it reminded her of where she grew up. The frame was slightly askew. Moving closer, Alexander carefully took the painting off the wall. Behind it was a small hole that had been drilled into the wall. Alexander peered into it and realized with a shock that it provided a clear view into the guest room, specifically of the bed where he was meant to recover. Why would Victoria need to spy on him while he slept? Before he could contemplate this disturbing discovery, he heard Victoria's voice from downstairs. She was back earlier than expected. Alexander quickly rehung the painting and made his way back to the guest room, his mind racing with new questions. That evening, Thomas returned with the flash drive Alexander had requested, slipping it to him during a moment when Victoria was speaking with the nurse in the hallway. "William Harrington is meeting with Imani right now," Thomas whispered. "She'll come by tomorrow with what she learns." After everyone had gone to bed, Alexander waited until the house was quiet before carefully connecting the flash drive to his tablet. It contained encrypted files of his most sensitive business information, things not even his closest advisors had access to. He'd maintained this private archive for years, a habit from his early days when corporate espionage was a constant threat. Now he created a new folder and began documenting everything he'd learned about Victoria, along with his suspicions. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record. The next morning, Victoria announced she had invited Howard over to discuss some loose ends with the power of attorney. "I thought we were putting that on hold," Alexander said carefully. "It's more important than ever now," Victoria insisted. "What if you had a more serious medical emergency? Decisions would need to be made quickly." She squeezed his hand. "I just want to protect you, darling." Alexander studied her face, the concerned expression, the loving gaze. She was convincing. If he hadn't discovered the hidden peephole, if Imani hadn't warned him, would he have seen through it? Howard arrived mid-morning with the documents. "Just a few signatures," he said, spreading the papers on the bedside table. "Standard procedure after a health event like yours." Alexander noticed Victoria hovering nearby, her attention fixed on the papers. "Actually, Howard, I'd like Imani to review these first." Victoria's smile faltered. "That paralegal again?" "Alexander, Howard is your attorney. If he says the documents are in order. Nevertheless, I'd like a second pair of eyes." Alexander turned to Howard. "Please have Ms. Jackson review them. We can finalize everything next week." Howard looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Of course, it's your decision." Victoria excused herself shortly after Howard left, claiming she had a hair appointment. Alexander could sense her frustration beneath her calm exterior. An hour later, Imani arrived. The nurse tried to turn her away, but Alexander called out that she was expected. As soon as they were alone, Imani's professional demeanor dropped, her expression urgent. "I met with William Harrington," she said without preamble. "He confirmed our suspicions and more. Tell me." Harrington discovered Victoria was poisoning him. Imani's voice was low but intense, small doses of something that mimicked his existing heart condition symptoms. His private doctor became suspicious when his health declined rapidly after Victoria moved in. They tested his hair for toxins and found evidence. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Did they go to the police? They were going to, but Victoria disappeared the day Harrington confronted her. He couldn't prove it was intentional. She could claim she was giving him his prescribed medication, and he wanted to avoid the publicity of a scandal. Alexander thought of his own medication, which Victoria managed meticulously. "The reaction that sent me to the hospital, Could have been deliberate, Imani finished. Harrington believes her method is to work slowly, making it look like natural progression of existing health problems, so she can maintain the image of the devoted caregiver while actually causing harm, Alexander said, pieces falling into place. The offshore accounts, the changing of my medical directives, the power of attorney. She's been setting the stage all along. There's more, Imani said. I did some digging into Victoria's background before she became Victoria Mercer. There are gaps, periods where she seems to disappear completely. But I found a police report from 15 years ago, a complaint filed by an elderly man named Harold Jenkins against his home health aide, a woman who matches Victoria's description but under yet another name. The complaint was withdrawn suddenly, and the woman disappeared. Alexander felt a cold certainty settling over him. The woman he'd planned to marry was a predator who targeted vulnerable wealthy men, and he'd nearly become her next victim. We need to confront her, he said. With Harrington's testimony and everything else we've found, we need to be careful, Imani cautioned. If she realizes we know, there's no telling what she might do. She's maintained this scheme for years. She won't give up easily. Alexander thought of the spy hole behind the painting, of Victoria's increasing control over his life. You're right. We need a plan. He reached for the flash drive he'd hidden under his pillow. And I think I know how to get the final proof. We need. Outside they heard a car door slam. Victoria returning from her appointment. Imani quickly gathered her things. Tomorrow, Alexander said. Bring Harrington here at noon. Victoria has a lunch scheduled with her charity committee. We'll have about 2 hours. Imani nodded and slipped out through the back door just as Victoria's key turned in the front lock. Who was that leaving? Victoria asked as she entered the room, her smile pleasant but her eyes watchful. Just Thomas, dropping off some reading material. Alexander held up a novel from his nightstand, forcing himself to smile back at the woman who had planned his death while professing to love him. How was your appointment? Victoria began chatting about her day, unaware that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation, and Alexander needed all his strength for what was to come. Morning light filtered through the curtains as Alexander pretended to sleep. Victoria moved quietly around the guest room, checking his monitors and adjusting his medication. He felt her pause beside the bed, standing there longer than necessary, watching him. It took all his willpower not to open his eyes. I'll be back after lunch, she whispered, though she thought he was asleep. Rest well, darling. Only when he heard the front door close and the car pull away did Alexander open his eyes. He immediately reached for the medication Victoria had left on his bedside table, pills she'd told him would help with his heart rhythm. Instead of taking them, he slipped them into a small plastic bag he'd hidden under his pillow. Thomas would take them to a lab for testing. Alexander pushed himself out of bed, feeling stronger than he had in days. Perhaps it was determination. Or perhaps it was because he'd been secretly discarding some of Victoria's special medicine when she wasn't looking. He went to the bedroom window and watched Victoria's car disappear down the driveway. The house felt different without her presence, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. He had about 30 minutes before Imani and William Harrington would arrive. Moving to the bathroom, Alexander showered and dressed in proper clothes, for the first time since returning from the hospital. Victoria had insisted he remain in pajamas. For comfort, she'd said, though he now understood it was part of her strategy to keep him in a patient role. Dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt, Alexander felt more like himself again. He made his way carefully downstairs to his office. Victoria had declared it off-limits during his recovery, claiming work would stress his heart. Now he understood she simply wanted to keep him away from his files and computer. The office was locked, but Alexander had a spare key hidden in a nearby bookshelf. Inside, he found his desk had been searched, papers rearranged, drawers left slightly open. His computer was missing, but he kept a backup laptop in a hidden compartment under the floorboards. Another security measure from his early business, days that now seemed prescient. Alexander retrieved the laptop and powered it up. He had just enough time to download the security footage from the hidden cameras in his bedroom and the guest room. cameras Victoria didn't know about, installed years ago after a break-in attempt. He had almost forgotten about them until discovering the peephole behind the painting. The doorbell rang just as Alexander finished copying the files to his flash drive. He closed the laptop and went to answer, finding Imani and an older man waiting on the doorstep. "Mr. Reeves," Imani said formally in case anyone was watching. "This is Mr. Harrington." Alexander invited them in, leading them to the living room rather than the guest room where Victoria had confined him. William Harrington was in his 70s, thin and distinguished-looking with silver hair and alert blue eyes. He walked with a slight limp but otherwise appeared healthy. "Thank you for coming," Alexander said, shaking the man's hand. "I understand it can't be easy to revisit this experience." Harrington's expression was grim. "When Ms. Jackson told me someone else might be in danger from that woman, I couldn't stay silent. Not again." For the next hour, Harrington shared his story. He had met Victoria, then calling herself Victoria Mercer, at a charity event in Miami 3 years ago. She had charmed him completely, and within months she had moved into his beachfront mansion. She was attentive, caring, everything a lonely old man could want, Harrington explained. "When I developed heart problems, she insisted on managing my medication personally." The pattern was eerily familiar to Alexander. Harrington described how his health had deteriorated rapidly, with symptoms that baffled his regular doctor. It was only when he consulted a specialist, without Victoria's knowledge, that poisoning was suspected. "The toxin was being mixed with my heart medication, small doses that accumulated over time," Harrington said. "When I confronted her, she denied everything, of course, but she knew I had evidence. She disappeared that night, taking jewelry and cash with her." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Alexander asked. Harrington looked down. Pride mostly, embarrassment at being so thoroughly fooled. And there were other factors. Her careful methods meant it would be difficult to prove in court. "My private investigator believed she had done this before, that it was a pattern. But by the time we realized the extent of it, she had vanished." "Until she surfaced as Victoria Lang," Imani said, "with a new target." Alexander showed them the flash drive. "I have security footage from the last few weeks. I haven't reviewed it all yet, but what I've seen is disturbing. Victoria tampering with my medication, searching my office at night." "We need to go to the police," Imani insisted. "With Mr. Harrington's testimony and your evidence." "Not yet," Alexander said. "First, I want to confront her. I want to hear her admit what she's done." "That's dangerous," Harrington warned. "When cornered, Victoria becomes different. The mask slips." "I'll be careful," Alexander promised. "But I need answers, for my own peace of mind." They spent the next hour preparing, going through the evidence they had collected. Imani had created a detailed timeline of Victoria's previous identities and the men she had targeted. Harrington provided medical reports showing the toxins found in his system. Alexander added the security footage and financial records showing Victoria's offshore accounts. "She should be returning around 1 o'clock, Alexander said, checking his watch. "Harrington, I think it's best if she doesn't see you immediately. Imani and I will talk to her first." They agreed on a plan. Harrington would wait in the study, while Alexander and Imani confronted Victoria in the living room. If she denied everything, they would bring Harrington in as their surprise witness. As 1 o'clock approached, tension filled the house. Alexander positioned himself in his usual spot in the guest room bed, wanting Victoria to find everything as she expected it. Imani waited in the kitchen, out of sight. At 1:15, they heard Victoria's car in the driveway. Alexander's heart raced, but not from illness, from anticipation. The front door opened and Victoria called out cheerfully, "Alexander, I'm home." "In here," he called back, his voice carefully modulated to sound tired. Victoria appeared in the doorway carrying a small paper bag. "I brought you those almond cookies you love from the bakery downtown." She smiled, the picture of thoughtfulness. "How are you feeling?" "Better, actually," Alexander said. "Good enough to have a visitor." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "A visitor? Darling, the doctor said you need rest." "Who?" Hello, Victoria. Imani stepped into the room, her expression calm but determined. Victoria's face hardened for just a moment before her smile returned, though it didn't reach her eyes. The paralegal again. Alexander, I don't think this is appropriate. You're recovering. Actually, Alexander said, sitting up straighter. I wanted to talk to you about my recovery and my medication. Your medication? Victoria's voice remained light, but her body tensed. What about it? Alexander held up the small plastic bag containing the pills she'd left that morning. I'm curious about these. They're not what my doctor prescribed. Victoria laughed, though it sounded forced. Don't be silly, of course they are. You're confused, darling. I'm not confused, Victoria. Or should I call you Victoria Mercer? Or was it Elizabeth Jenkins before that? The color drained from Victoria's face, but she recovered quickly. I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate this interrogation when I've done nothing but take care of you. We know about Richard Cantwell, Imani said quietly, and Gregory Palmer, both wealthy older men with heart conditions who died after you entered their lives. This is ridiculous. Victoria snapped, her pleasant demeanor cracking. Alexander, I want her to leave now. We also know about the offshore accounts, Alexander continued, ignoring her demand. The money you've been moving out of my accounts, small amounts, not enough to notice immediately. Clever. Victoria's expression changed completely, the mask of caring falling away to reveal cold calculation. You can't prove anything, and who would believe you? A sick old man and an ambitious paralegal trying to get close to a billionaire. That's where you're wrong, Alexander said. We have proof, security footage of you tampering with my medication, financial records, and a witness. Victoria's eyes darted toward the door, as if considering escape. What witness? As if on cue, William Harrington stepped into the room. Victoria's face went completely white. Hello, Victoria, Harrington said coldly. Or should I say Elizabeth? It's been a while. For a moment, no one spoke. Victoria looked from Harrington to Alexander to Imani, her mind visibly racing through options. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. Well played, Alexander. I underestimated you. She turned to Harrington. And you. I thought you were too embarrassed to ever speak about what happened. I was, Harrington admitted, until I learned you were targeting someone else. Victoria's posture changed, becoming almost casual as she perched on the edge of a chair. So what now? You go to the police? With what? Some circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a jilted old man? The police are already on their way, Imani said. And we have more than you think. The lab results from Alexander's medication, showing substances that aren't part of his prescription. The hidden peephole you created to spy on him while he slept. Your history under different names. For the first time, Victoria seemed uncertain. It won't stick. It never does. That's why I'm careful. Maybe in the past you escaped consequences, Alexander said, but not this time. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. Then, in a movement so sudden it caught them all by surprise, she lunged for her purse on the nearby table, pulling out a small vial. Don't come any closer, she warned, backing toward the door. This is what I've been giving you, Alexander. A single concentrated dose would stop your heart in minutes. Alexander felt a chill, realizing how close he had come to death. Victoria, don't make this worse for yourself. Worse? She laughed again, that same humorless sound. You have no idea what worse looks like. I've spent my entire life surviving, doing what was necessary. Men like you with all your wealth and power, you never see people like me until it's too late. This isn't about survival, Harrington said. It's about greed and manipulation. Victoria ignored him, her attention fixed on Alexander. I could have made your passing so peaceful you wouldn't have felt a thing. Now you'll live to grow old and feeble, watching your body and mind fail you piece by piece. Is that really what you want? I'd rather live honestly than die at the hands of someone pretending to love me, Alexander said quietly. Something flickered, in Victoria's eyes, perhaps a hint of genuine emotion, though whether it was regret or simply frustration at being caught was impossible to tell. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the tension. Victoria glanced toward the window, then back at the three people watching her. "This isn't over," she said, her voice suddenly calm. "You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me." Before any of them could react, she turned and ran from the room. They heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the sound of a door slamming. "The police will catch her," Imani said, moving to Alexander's side. "Are you all right?" Alexander nodded, though his heart was racing. The confrontation had been more draining than he'd anticipated. "I should have seen through her sooner." "All?" The signs were there. "She's a professional manipulator," Harrington said. "She knows exactly how to gain trust and exploit vulnerability." The police arrived minutes later, quickly securing the house. Victoria had indeed fled, taking nothing but her purse. Officers found her car still in the driveway, suggesting she had escaped on foot, perhaps to a vehicle parked nearby. As Alexander gave his statement to the police, showing them the evidence they had gathered, he felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at being deceived, relief at escaping Victoria's plan, and gratitude toward the young paralegal who had risked her career to warn him. Imani stood nearby, answering questions from another officer. She caught Alexander's eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. It struck him then how different she was from Victoria. Genuine where Victoria was calculating, straightforward where Victoria was manipulative. "We'll find her, Mr. Reeves," the detective promised. "With this much evidence, she won't be able to disappear so easily this time." Alexander nodded, but he wasn't thinking about Victoria anymore. He was thinking about the strange twist of fate that had brought Imani into his office that day, and how her simple act of speaking up had quite possibly saved his life. As the police finished their work and prepared to leave, Alexander approached Imani. "I don't think I've properly thanked you," he said. "If you hadn't warned me about that power of attorney document." "I was just doing what was right," she said simply. "Few people would have taken that risk," Alexander countered. "You put your job on the line for a stranger." Imani smiled. "Not a stranger anymore, I think." Alexander realized she was right. Through this ordeal, he had come to trust this young woman more than people he'd known for years. No, not a stranger at all. As they stood in the doorway watching the police cars drive away, Alexander felt, for the first time in months, truly free. Victoria was gone, her web of lies exposed. There would be challenges ahead: the legal process, the inevitable publicity, the need to rebuild trust in his own judgment. But he would face them honestly, with clear eyes, and he wouldn't be facing them alone. He glanced at Imani, who was gathering her notes and documents, her focus unwavering even after such an intense confrontation. She had proven herself not just intelligent and perceptive, but courageous and principled. "Victoria's still out there," Imani said, voicing the thought that had been at the back of Alexander's mind. "Yes," he agreed, "and she's not one to give up easily." "Then neither are we," Imani said with quiet determination. Alexander nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't over yet, but whatever came next, he was ready for it. The billionaire and the paralegal, an unlikely alliance, formed through crisis, bound by truth and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months had passed since Victoria disappeared. Spring had given way to summer, and now autumn painted Central Park in fiery colors, visible from Alexander's penthouse windows. He stood watching the sunset, feeling stronger than he had in years. The search for Victoria had gone cold. Despite international alerts and the efforts of private investigators, she seemed to have vanished completely. The police believed she had fled the country, likely using another identity from her collection. The offshore accounts Alexander had discovered had been emptied within hours of their confrontation. But life had moved forward. Alexander's health had improved dramatically once he stopped taking Victoria's special medications. Tests confirmed what they had suspected. She had been slowly poisoning him with a compound that mimicked and worsened his heart condition symptoms. The scandal had made headlines briefly. Billionaire's Black Widow, the tabloids called her, but public interest had waned as news stories took its place. Alexander had granted no interviews, preferring to let the official investigation proceed without media interference. "You're looking thoughtful," a voice said behind him. Alexander turned to see Imani entering the office carrying a stack of file folders. In the months since the confrontation with Victoria, Imani had become an integral part of Alexander's life, first as a legal advisor helping him untangle the mess Victoria had created, then as a trusted confidant and friend. "Just reflecting," Alexander said. "It's been exactly 6 months today." Imani set the folders on the desk. "Thinking about her?" "Actually, I was thinking about you," Alexander replied honestly. "About that moment when you spoke up in this very room. One person doing the right thing changed everything." Imani smiled, though she looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "I was terrified, you know. My hands were shaking under the table. You didn't show it." "Years of practice," she said. "Being the only black woman in too many rooms teaches you to hide fear." Alexander nodded, understanding better now than he had 6 months ago. In their time working together, he'd witnessed firsthand how often Imani's voice was dismissed or her authority questioned, even with his explicit backing. "Did you see the police report?" Imani asked, changing the subject. "Yes, another dead end." Alexander sighed. "They tracked her to Montreal, but the trail went cold. She's good at disappearing." "She's had lots of practice," Imani reminded him. "But at least your foundation is making progress." The Alexander Reeves Foundation for Elder Protection had been established 3 months earlier, dedicated to educating older adults about financial exploitation and supporting law enforcement in tracking predators like Victoria. Alexander had funded it generously, and Imani had helped shape its mission, drawing on her legal expertise. "The conference next week should help raise more awareness," Alexander said. "Are you ready for your speech?" Imani nodded, though she looked nervous. "I think so. Public speaking isn't my favorite thing, but the topic matters too much to stay silent." Alexander smiled at her choice of words. Not staying silent was what had drawn them together in the first place. The intercom buzzed, and Thomas's voice came through. "Mr. Reeves, your daughter has arrived." "Send her up," Alexander replied, feeling a familiar mixture of hope and anxiety. One unexpected consequence of the Victoria ordeal had been the tentative reconnection with his daughter, Lily. After learning about the poisoning attempt, she had reached out, and they had begun the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. 20 years of estrangement couldn't be erased overnight, but they were trying. When Lily entered the office, Alexander was struck again by how much she resembled her mother. Now in her 40s, Lily had the same determined walk and direct gaze that had first attracted him to his ex-wife. "Dad," she said, giving him a quick, slightly awkward hug. "You're looking well." "Better every day," he assured her. "You remember Imani?" Lily and Imani exchanged warm greetings. They had formed their own connection over the past months, bonding, initially over their shared concern for Alexander, and later discovering common interests in art and literature. "I can't stay long," Lily said. "Just wanted to drop off these photos from Max's soccer tournament." She handed Alexander an envelope containing pictures of his 13-year-old grandson, whom he was just getting to know. "He looks more like you every time I see him," Alexander observed, studying the photos. "Poor kid," Lily joked, then grew more serious. "He's asking when you'll come to one of his games." "I'd like that," Alexander said, meaning it. "Maybe next weekend?" As Lily and Alexander continued their conversation, Imani excused herself to take a call in the hallway. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression was troubled. "What is it?" Alexander asked once Lily had left, promising to coordinate about the soccer game. "That was Detective Rivera," Imani said, referring to the police officer in charge of Victoria's case. "They found something." Alexander felt a chill. "Victoria?" Not exactly. They identified another victim, a man in Seattle named Lawrence Chen. He died 3 years ago of apparent heart failure. His home nurse at the time was a woman matching Victoria's description, using yet another name. After Harrington, but before me, Alexander said, the timeline clicking into place. Imani nodded. His family became suspicious when they discovered changes to his will shortly before his death. They've been fighting it in court, but no one connected it to Victoria until now. What does Rivera want? She's asking if you'll speak with the Chen family. They're coming to New York next week to meet with the FBI. Your case has the most evidence. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering the request. He had tried to put Victoria behind him, to focus on healing and moving forward. But if there were other victims, other families seeking closure, I'll do it, he said finally. They deserve answers, just like I did. Imani smiled approvingly. I thought you'd say that. I'll set it up. The meeting with the Chen family was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Alexander spent the intervening days preparing himself mentally, reviewing the evidence they had gathered about Victoria's methods. Imani worked with the Foundation's researchers to create a comprehensive timeline of Victoria's activities across her various identities. On Tuesday morning, Alexander and Imani arrived at the Federal Building in downtown Manhattan. Detective Rivera met them in the lobby, along with FBI agent Daniels, who had taken over coordinating the multi-state investigation. The Chen family is already here, Rivera told them as they rode the elevator. They're eager to meet you. How much do they know? Alexander asked. The basics, Daniels replied. That we've connected their father's case to several others, including yours. That we believe the same woman was involved. The conference room was simple and functional. 3 people rose as Alexander and Imani entered. A middle-aged man and woman who resembled each other enough to be clearly siblings, and an elderly woman who Alexander guessed was their mother. Mr. Reeves, the man said, stepping forward to shake his hand. I'm Peter Chen. This is my sister Grace and our mother Mei Ling. Thank you for coming. Alexander shook their hands in turn. This is Imani Jackson, who was instrumental in uncovering Victoria's scheme. As they all sat down, Alexander noted the grief still visible on their faces, especially the mother's. Lawrence Chen had been gone for 3 years, but for his family the wound was being reopened with these new revelations. We called her Rebecca Miller, Grace said quietly. She came highly recommended as a home health aide after Dad's first heart attack. She was so kind at first, Mei Ling added, her accent slight but noticeable. Always making his favorite foods, remembering his medications. That's her pattern, Imani explained gently. She gains trust by being exceptionally attentive. It's only later that things begin to change. For the next hour, they compared experiences. The similarities were striking. Victoria's careful isolation of her victim from family and friends, the gradual assumption of control over financial matters, the mysterious worsening of health problems. The worst part was doubting ourselves, Peter said, his voice tight with emotion. When we raised concerns about Dad's medication, Rebecca suggested we were interfering with his care. She even had his doctor call us to say the same thing. She's exceptionally skilled at manipulation, Alexander acknowledged. She played on my fears about aging and illness to make me dependent on her. If it wasn't for Imani speaking up, he added, glancing at her, I would have signed over everything to her, and I likely wouldn't be alive today. Grace Chen turned to Imani with newfound respect. You saw through her when no one else did? Imani shook her head modestly. I just noticed discrepancies in the legal documents, things that didn't add up. You did more than notice, Alexander corrected. You had the courage to say something, when it would have been easier to stay silent. As the meeting continued, Agent Daniels shared the latest on the investigation. Victoria's trail had gone cold in Canada, but they had identified a pattern to her movements. She typically spent 12-18 months with each victim, meticulously building her scheme. She was patient, careful, and thorough. We believe she's already established a new identity, Daniels said. Possibly in Europe or South America. So she gets away with it? Mei Ling asked, her voice breaking. After everything she's done? We're not giving up, Rivera assured her. With each case we connect to her, we build a stronger profile. Every piece of evidence helps. And in the meantime, Alexander added, we can work to prevent her from finding new victims. He told them about the foundation, about the educational programs they were developing and the support network for families. We can't undo what happened to Lawrence or what almost happened to me, but we can try to protect others. As the meeting wrapped up, Peter Chen approached Alexander privately. My sister and I have been discussing starting a support group for families like ours, people who've lost loved ones to these predators. The foundation would be honored to help, Alexander said immediately. Outside the federal building, Alexander and Imani paused on the steps. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. That was harder than I expected, Alexander admitted. Imani nodded. Seeing their grief, it makes it real in a different way. They began walking toward where Thomas waited with the car. Neither spoke for a block, both lost in their thoughts. I've been thinking about the foundation, Alexander said finally. About its future. What about it? It needs leadership, someone who understands both the legal aspects and the human cost of what people like Victoria do. He glanced at her. Someone like you. Imani stopped walking. Me? Alexander. I'm just a paralegal with night school law classes. Not anymore, Alexander pointed out. You passed the bar last month, and you're the reason I'm alive to have this conversation. Running a foundation is completely different from legal work, which is why I'd like you to take a year to learn the ropes. Work alongside me, meet with potential partners, help shape the vision. Alexander had been considering this for weeks. After that, if you're interested, I'd like you to take over as executive director. Imani was silent for so long that Alexander began to worry he'd offended her. Finally, she spoke. Why me? Really? Alexander understood the question beneath the question. In her experience, opportunities often came with unspoken expectations or hidden motives. Because you saw what no one else saw, he said simply. Because you spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Because you have the perfect combination of legal knowledge and moral courage that this work requires. He smiled slightly. And because I trust you more than anyone else. Imani considered his words. I'd need to finish my cases at the firm. Of course. And I'd want to be involved in program development from the start, not just administration. Absolutely. And I'd need complete autonomy to speak publicly about these issues, even when it makes powerful people uncomfortable. Alexander laughed. Imani, making powerful people uncomfortable by speaking truth is exactly why I want you for this role. She finally smiled. Then yes, I accept. They resumed walking, both feeling a sense of possibility and purpose that hadn't been there before. Victoria's still out there somewhere? Imani said after a moment. Yes, Alexander agreed. And we may never find her. That bothers you. It did, he admitted. But I've realized something. Victoria's power came from secrecy and isolation. She targeted people who were vulnerable and alone, counting on no one noticing or speaking up. And now people are paying attention. Imani finished his thought. Exactly. Alexander looked at the young woman walking beside him, the unlikely hero, in his story, the person who had reminded him that sometimes one voice was enough to change everything. Victoria wanted to take my life, but instead, she gave me a new purpose for it. As they reached the car, Alexander thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he had been a lonely billionaire signing away his autonomy to a woman who saw him only as a target. Now he was reconnecting with his family, building a foundation to help others and planning for a future he hadn't expected to have. All because a young paralegal had seen something wrong and found the courage to say, "Don't give her power of attorney." Some might call it coincidence or luck. Alexander preferred to see it as a reminder that the world was full of unexpected heroes, people who spoke truth when it mattered most. And while Victoria might never face justice for her crimes, her greatest defeat had already happened. The isolation and secrecy she relied on had been replaced with connection, awareness, and purpose. That, Alexander thought as Thomas opened the car door, was perhaps the most fitting justice of all.